Some children do not grow up slowly, they accelerate, not because they want to, because they have to. While other children worry about toys, games, and small disappointments, this child learns something much heavier: silence, tension, responsibility. They learn to read moods before they learn to read books. They learn to stay quiet before they learn to speak freely. They learn to solve problems before they learn how to play. And no one calls it trauma. They call it maturity. You're so responsible. You're so understanding. You're so strong for your age. But what they don't see is the cost. A child who grows up too fast does not skip childhood. They bury it, and bury parts do not disappear. They wait. Psychologically, when a child grows up too fast, it is usually because safety was unstable. Maybe there was emotional chaos. Maybe there was financial stress. Maybe there was a parent who needed emotional support instead of giving it. Maybe there was conflict that forced the child to become the mediator. Whatever the cause, one thing becomes clear early: there is no space for me to be small. So the child adapts, and adaptation becomes identity. They become the helper, the fixer, the calm one, the strong one. They swallow fear so others don't have to feel it. They regulate the emotions of adults. They carry burdens too heavy for their nervous system. And here is what happens psychologically. When a child grows up too fast, they split. One part becomes hyper-responsible. The other part remains frozen at the age they were never allowed to live. This is not weakness. It is survival. The brain prioritizes safety over authenticity. If being easy keeps the peace, they become easy. If being invisible avoids conflict, they become invisible. If being strong earns love, they become strong. But strength built from survival is not the same as strength built from security. It is tense. It is alert. It never fully relaxes. As adults, these individuals often look composed, mature, independent. But internally, something feels missing because they were never allowed to experience carefree exploration, safe dependence, unconditional comfort. They became independent too early. And early independence is not empowerment. It is defense. The nervous system of a child who grew up too fast is constantly scanning for shifts in tone, for subtle tension, for potential conflict. They develop hyper-awareness. They read micro-expressions instinctively. They sense emotional shifts before others notice. This becomes a strength later in life. But it begins as protection, and protection always has a cost. The cost is this: they struggle to ask for help, because asking feels dangerous. They struggle to express need, because need feels shameful. They struggle to relax, because relaxation feels unsafe. When you grow up too fast, you learn that your role is to manage the world, not to be cared for by it. So even as adults, they become the responsible friend, the dependable partner, the one who has it together. But inside, there's exhaustion, because they are still parenting themselves, and sometimes, unknowingly, parenting others. Now here is something deeper. When a child becomes the emotional regulator of the household, they develop something called parentification. Parentification is when a child takes on adult emotional or practical responsibilities. This creates a hidden wound, because love becomes tied to usefulness. If I help, I am valued. If I fix things, I belong. If I am strong, I am safe. This belief system carries into adulthood. They overfunction in relationships. They solve problems that are not theirs. They feel guilty resting. They feel uncomfortable receiving. Receiving feels foreign, because they were trained to give. Now imagine what happens in romantic relationships. They attract people who need saving, people who are chaotic, people who are emotionally unstable, because chaos feels familiar, calm feels suspicious. If your nervous system was trained in instability, peace feels empty, and so they recreate the environment they survived, not consciously, but psychologically, because the nervous system prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar safety. Now here is the silent truth. The child who grew up too fast rarely complains. They minimize their own story. They say things like, "It wasn't that bad. Other people had it worse. I turned out fine." But functioning is not the same as healing. Achievement is not the same as wholeness. Maturity is not the same as innocence restored. The child inside them still exists, the one who wanted to be held, the one who wanted to be protected, the one who wanted permission to be messy, loud, and imperfect. But that child was silenced by responsibility. And when responsibility becomes identity, vulnerability feels threatening, because vulnerability risks losing the role that kept them safe. So they become strong, reliable, too reliable, independent, too independent. And no one notices the cost of that too. The psychology of growing up too fast is not about weakness. It is about adaptation. But adaptation that once protected you can later imprison you. The question becomes, how do you slow down when your entire identity was built on speed? How do you learn to need when your survival depended on not needing? How do you rest when your nervous system was trained to monitor? This is where healing begins. But first, you must recognize something powerful. Growing up too fast was not your strength. It was your strategy. And strategies can be updated. When a child grows up too fast, they learn one dangerous belief very early. My feelings are too much. Maybe no one said it directly, but the environment communicated it. When they cried, someone was already overwhelmed. When they needed attention, someone else needed it more. When they were scared, there was no room for fear. So they adapted. They shrank their needs. They controlled their emotions. They became low maintenance. And this is where hyper-responsibility begins. Hyper-responsibility is not just being reliable. It is feeling responsible for everyone's emotional state. It is walking into a room and instantly sensing tension. It is adjusting your tone to avoid triggering someone. It is fixing problems before they are assigned to you. It is apologizing even when you did nothing wrong. Because deep down there is a fear. If I create discomfort, I will lose connection. This child learns to prevent conflict instead of expressing truth. They monitor. They calculate. They smooth everything over. And adults praise this. You're so mature. You're so considerate. But what is rarely seen is the internal cost. Hyper-responsibility creates chronic anxiety. The nervous system never turns off. Even in calm environments, it searches for potential disruption because growing up too fast trained the brain that chaos can appear without warning. So vigilance becomes safety. But vigilance prevents rest. As adults, these individuals often feel exhausted in relationships, not because others demand too much, but because they demand too much from themselves. They overgive, they overextend, they overanalyze, they anticipate problems that may never come. And they rarely express their own limits, because limits feel selfish. When you grew up too fast, you learned that your role was to carry weight. And if you stop carrying weight, you fear being abandoned. Now here is something subtle. Children who grow up too fast often struggle with receiving love, not because they don't want it, but because it feels unfamiliar. They are comfortable being needed. They are uncomfortable being cared for. Being needed feels safe. Being cared for feels vulnerable, because care exposes unmet needs, and unmet needs connect to early wounds. So instead of receiving deeply, they perform competence. They help, they guide, they protect. But rarely do they lean back and allow themselves to be held. And this creates imbalance in adult relationships. They become the stable one, the grounded one, the strong one. But internally they feel unseen, because no one is looking for the child behind the strength. Now we move into another layer. The fear of being a burden. This fear becomes central in their psychology. They hesitate before asking for support. They minimize their struggles. They hesitate before expressing pain. They say things like, "It's fine. Don't worry about it. I'll handle it," even when they are overwhelmed. Because somewhere in their nervous system is a memory. Needing too much creates stress. Stress creates rejection. So they stay self-contained. But self-containment has a cost. It isolates. It prevents intimacy. True intimacy requires mutual dependence. But when you grew up too fast, dependence feels dangerous. So you build walls disguised as independence. You tell yourself you are strong. But strength that cannot receive becomes rigid, and rigidity breaks under pressure. Now here is something important. Growing up too fast often creates perfectionism. If mistakes cause tension in childhood, the child learns to avoid mistakes at all costs. Perfection becomes safety. Achievement becomes identity. Success becomes armor. But armor is heavy, and it prevents softness. Perfectionism is not about excellence. It is about control. If everything is controlled, nothing can explode. But life cannot be fully controlled. And when something goes wrong, the adult who grew up too fast often feels disproportionate shame. Because mistakes feel like failure, and failure feels like danger. Now consider how this affects career. These individuals often become high achievers. Disciplined, focused, resilient. They can handle pressure better than most. Because pressure feels familiar, but they also struggle to stop. Rest feels unearned. Celebration feels uncomfortable. Because their nervous system is calibrated for survival, not enjoyment. Enjoyment feels like a luxury, and luxuries feel unsafe, so they keep moving, keep fixing, keep building. But inside, there is a quiet grief. Grief for the childhood that never fully happened. Grief for the softness that was postponed. Grief for the version of themselves that never got to be carefree. And here is the paradox. They are often admired, respected, trusted, but rarely fully understood. Because competence hides vulnerability, people assume they don't need help, and they reinforce that assumption. The psychology of growing up too fast is layered. It produces capability, but it also produces loneliness. It creates emotional intelligence, but it also creates emotional suppression. It builds independence, but it also builds isolation. And the deepest wound is this. They learn to love through usefulness, not through presence. So they unconsciously believe, if I stop being useful, I will stop being loved. This belief runs quietly in adulthood. It drives overworking, overgiving, overfunctioning, until exhaustion forces reflection. Healing begins when they realize something radical. Their worth was never supposed to be tied to performance. Their value was never meant to be earned through responsibility. They were allowed to be small. They were allowed to need. They were allowed to rest. But they were never shown how, and learning that now feels unfamiliar. But unfamiliar does not mean impossible. It means new. When a child grows up too fast, something important happens internally. One part of them becomes hypermature. Another part stays the same age. Frozen. This frozen part does not disappear. It waits. It waits in silence. Behind achievements. Behind calmness. Behind responsibility. The adult version of them walks through life composed. But inside, there is still a child who never finished being one. This is why many adults who grew up too fast experience emotional contradictions. They can handle crisis without breaking, but they feel overwhelmed by intimacy. They can manage businesses, families, and responsibilities, but they struggle to express simple needs. They can support everyone else, but feel deeply alone. The inner child remains unintegrated, and unintegrated parts show up in subtle ways. Sometimes it appears as sudden emotional shutdown. When things feel too intense, they go numb. Numbness was once protection. If emotions were overwhelming in childhood, shutting down was survival. But in adulthood, that same mechanism blocks connection. Other times, the frozen child appears as unexpected sensitivity. A small rejection feels huge. A delayed message feels threatening. A shift in tone feels alarming, because the nervous system still carries early patterns. When love felt uncertain, the body learned to anticipate loss. Now, even safe relationships can trigger old alarms. The adult mind says, "This is fine." The body whispers, "Be careful." And so they live in quiet vigilance. This creates a difficult pattern in relationships. They crave closeness, but when closeness appears, it feels overwhelming. Because true intimacy requires softness, and softness was never safe, so they oscillate, close, then distant, open, then guarded, caring, then withdrawn, not because they are unstable, because they are protecting a part that was never protected. Now here is something many do not talk about. Growing up too fast often disconnects a person from joy, not because they are unhappy, but because joy was not prioritized, play was not safe, laughter was limited, spontaneity was replaced with responsibility. So as adults, they may feel serious by default. Even when life is stable, they may struggle with silliness, with lightness, with doing something just for fun, because their identity was built around being needed, not around being free. Freedom feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar can feel unsafe. Now consider this. When you grow up too fast, you become highly attuned to others. You can sense shifts in energy instantly. You can detect dishonesty. You can anticipate dishonesty. You can anticipate conflict. This creates high emotional intelligence, but it also creates hyper-awareness. Hyper-awareness makes it difficult to relax fully. You are always slightly scanning, even in safe environments, because the body remembers what the mind has minimized. Trauma is not only about extreme events, it is about chronic emotional stress, about never knowing when things might shift, but always adjusting to maintain peace. That adjustment becomes automatic, and automatic patterns feel like personality. I'm just independent. I'm just mature. I'm just responsible. But often those traits began as survival strategies. The child who grew up too fast learned to be strong before they learned to be safe. Strength without safety creates tension, and tension becomes baseline. Now we move to something very important: anger. Many people who grew up too fast struggle with anger, not because they don't feel it, because they suppressed it. If anger created conflict in childhood, it was dangerous. So they swallowed it. They became agreeable, diplomatic, understanding. But unexpressed anger does not vanish. It transforms, sometimes into anxiety, sometimes into resentment, sometimes into sudden emotional explosions that surprise even them, because suppressed emotions accumulate. Healing requires acknowledging something uncomfortable. They were not supposed to handle everything alone. They were not supposed to be the stable one at 7, or 8, or 10. They were supposed to be children. But instead, they became caretakers of emotional environments. And that role feels hard to release, because it became identity. If they stop being the strong one, who are they? If they stop fixing, who are they? If they stop carrying, who are they? This is where identity crisis often appears in adulthood. When the hyper-responsible identity begins to crack, it feels destabilizing, but it is actually integration beginning. The frozen child part wants space. It wants expression. It wants permission to exist without performance. Integration means allowing both parts to coexist, the capable adult and the child who still needs softness. Now here is something powerful. The child who grew up too fast often becomes deeply compassionate because they understand struggle early. They understand pain. They understand pressure. But compassion without boundaries becomes self-neglect. So part of healing is learning to direct compassion inward, to say, I was doing the best I could. I adapted to survive. I am allowed to need now. This is not weakness. It is recalibration. The nervous system can learn safety, but it must experience it repeatedly, slowly, gently, consistently. And safety often begins internally, not externally. When the adult self begins protecting the inner child instead of suppressing it, something shifts. The hypervigilance softens. The perfectionism loosens. The fear of being a burden decreases because the child inside finally feels seen, not for performance, but for presence. The child who grew up too fast does not know how to move slowly. Speed became safety. Responsibility became rhythm. Being ahead of problems became instinct. So when life becomes calm, something strange happens. They feel restless, uneasy, almost guilty. Because calm was never their normal. Chaos was, even if chaos was subtle, even if chaos was emotional. The nervous system that grew up in tension becomes addicted to intensity, not because it enjoys pain, because it recognizes it. The familiar feels safe even when it hurts. The unfamiliar feels unsafe even when it heals. So slowing down feels uncomfortable. Rest feels undeserved. Silence feels suspicious. When you grew up too fast, productivity became proof of worth. If you were useful, you were valuable. If you were needed, you belonged. So when you stop doing, a question appears. Who am I if I'm not needed? This is the core fear. Because your identity was built around function, not around being. Healing begins when you separate identity from usefulness. You're not valuable because you carry weight. You're valuable because you exist. But this shift is not intellectual. It is emotional, and emotional rewiring takes repetition. The first step is noticing overfunctioning. Notice when you jump to fix things that are not yours. Notice when you apologize for existing. Notice when you offer solutions before someone asks. Notice when you feel anxious if someone is upset, even when it has nothing to do with you. These patterns are automatic, and automatic does not mean permanent. The second step is tolerating discomfort. When you stop overfunctioning, people may react. They may expect you to fix things. They may expect you to carry more. When you step back, there may be tension. But tension does not mean danger. It means recalibration. Your nervous system will interpret that tension as threat. But you must teach it something new. Conflict does not equal abandonment. Need does not equal rejection. Rest does not equal laziness. These new beliefs feel fragile at first, because the old ones kept you safe. But survival safety is not the same as emotional safety. The third step is learning to receive. Receiving attention. Receiving care. Receiving care. Receiving help. At first it may feel awkward. You may feel exposed, vulnerable, even suspicious, because you are used to being the strong one. But strength that never receives becomes brittle. Letting someone support you does not make you weak. It makes you balanced. Balanced nervous systems do not swing between hypercontrol and collapse. They regulate. Regulation is the goal, not perfection. Now we address the frozen child directly. What did they miss? Play, messiness, permission to be imperfect. Healing often looks like reintroducing those elements intentionally. Allow yourself to do something without productivity attached. Allow yourself to fail without punishment. Allow yourself to say, I don't know. These small acts feel radical because they challenge old wiring. Another layer of healing is anger. The anger that was suppressed deserves safe expression, not explosive, not destructive, but acknowledged. It is okay to admit it wasn't fair. It was too much. I deserved support. This acknowledgement does not mean blaming. It means validating. Validating releases shame. Shame was the glue that held hyper-responsibility together. When shame softens, self-compassion grows. Self-compassion changes behavior more effectively than self-criticism ever did. Now here is something profound. The child who grew up too fast often fears becoming dependent. They equate dependence with weakness. But healthy dependence is not weakness. It is interdependence. No human thrives alone. Independence is valuable. Isolation is not. Allowing others to see your softer side deepens connection, and deep connection heals attachment wounds. You must experience relationships where you are valued not for what you do, but for who you are. This may feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, but over time, the nervous system learns. Safety can exist without performance. Love can exist without usefulness. Connection can exist without self-erasure. Now imagine something. Imagine the younger version of you sitting beside you, tired, trying hard, scanning for tension, trying not to make mistakes. What would you tell them? Would you criticize them? Or would you say, you don't have to hold everything anymore. You're allowed to rest. You're allowed to need. This internal dialogue is not childish. It is integration. Integration means the adult self protects the child self, not suppresses it. When that shift happens, something powerful occurs. The hypervigilance reduces, the perfectionism softens, the fear of being a burden decreases, because the burden is no longer carried alone. The adult version of you is strong now, strong enough to set boundaries, strong enough to set boundaries, strong enough to say no, strong enough to let go of roles that no longer serve. You do not have to prove strength anymore. You already survived. Now strength becomes gentler, more flexible, more human. Healing does not erase the resilience you built. It refines it. You keep the emotional intelligence, the responsibility, the depth, but you release the self-neglect, the chronic tension, the silent loneliness. And something else appears, lightness, not childish immaturity, but playful presence, the ability to laugh without scanning, the ability to rest without guilt, the ability to receive without shrinking. That is not weakness, that is wholeness. There is a moment in healing that feels quiet but profound. It is the moment you realize, I don't have to be who I became to survive. For the child who grew up too fast, this realization can feel unsettling, because survival shaped identity. Responsibility shaped worth, strength shaped belonging. Letting go of those patterns can feel like losing yourself, but you are not losing yourself. You are meeting the parts of you that were postponed. Growing up too fast did not ruin you. It shaped you. It gave you depth, awareness, resilience. But it also took something. Ease, softness, permission. Healing is not about undoing the past. It is about expanding beyond it. The adult you are now has choices. The child you were did not. You can choose boundaries. You can choose rest. You can choose relationships where care flows both ways. You can choose to stop carrying what was never yours. This choice may feel unfamiliar, but unfamiliar does not mean wrong. It means new. One of the most important shifts is redefining strength. Strength is no longer endurance. It is discernment. Knowing when to step in, knowing when to step back, knowing when to help, knowing when to let others carry their own weight. The child who grew up too fast learned to anticipate. The healed adult learns to respond. Responding instead of anticipating creates space. Space creates breath. Breath creates regulation. Regulation creates peace. And peace was what you were missing. Not excitement, not success, not validation. Peace. Another important shift is learning to trust safety. Safety does not always feel dramatic. It often feels boring at first. Stable, predictable, calm. For someone raised in emotional intensity, calm can feel empty. But calm is where your nervous system finally rests. Rest is not laziness. Rest is repair. You may notice grief surfacing during this phase. Grief for what you didn't receive. Grief for how young you were when you had to be strong. Grief for moments you never got to experience. This grief is not regression. It is release. Grief honors what mattered, and what mattered was you. You were never asking for too much. You were asking for what children need. Protection, consistency, care. Now, as an adult, you get to offer those things to yourself. Not perfectly, but consistently. Healing is not dramatic. It is repetitive. It is choosing rest again, choosing honesty again, choosing softness again. Even when the old reflex says, be strong, handle it, don't need, you gently say, I'm allowed to need. This inner dialogue reshapes identity. Over time, something shifts in your relationships. You stop attracting people who need saving. You stop feeling responsible for everyone's emotions. You stop confusing intensity with connection. You start choosing people who are emotionally available. People who don't need you to perform. People who don't collapse if you set boundaries. This may reduce your social circle, but it deepens your life. Depth replaces exhaustion. Mutuality replaces overfunctioning. Presence replaces vigilance. You may also notice something surprising. Joy returns in small ways. Unforced laughter, moments of play, spontaneous curiosity. These moments may feel unfamiliar, even awkward at first, but they are signs of integration. The frozen child is thawing, and thawing is gentle. It cannot be rushed. You do not need to relive the past to heal it. You need to feel safe enough now. Safe enough to slow down. Safe enough to rest. Safe enough to say no. Safe enough to receive. If you grew up too fast, you were never weak. You were adaptive. You were perceptive. You were resilient. But resilience does not mean you must live in survival forever. You are allowed to live in presence now. You are allowed to be supported. You are allowed to be imperfect. You are allowed to be human. The child who grew up too fast does not need to disappear. They need to be welcomed back, not as a burden, but as a part of you that deserves care. When that happens, something powerful emerges. You keep your depth, but you lose the weight. You keep your insight, but you lose the tension. You keep your strength, but it becomes softer, kinder, more sustainable. And for the first time, you are not ahead of life. You are inside it, present, breathing, whole.